Well, welcome everyone. Thank you to all of you who are here joining us online and in person today. This is part 2 of a conversation that focuses on the human right to water from the perspective of tribal community members and research partners. Part 1 took place on May 11th and featured Vita Becker, Cal EPA's Deputy Secretary for Environmental Justice, Tribal Affairs, and Border Relations, and Heather Tanana, law professor at the University of Utah. Both are members of the Navajo Nation. Vita and Heather spoke with us about legal and practical aspects of achieving universal water access to tribal lands. An important theme that emerged from their presentation was that any proposed solutions need to consider both the unique environmental challenges that a community faces and also understand the historical context of oppression and inhumane treatment that Indigenous communities have suffered. My colleague Clare Pace and I are so pleased to be moderating today's event. Clare is a researcher and a key member of the Water Equity Science Shop at the UC Berkeley. And I'm Iris Stewart-Frey, a professor of environmental science and a faculty member of the Environmental Justice and the Common Good Initiative here at Santa Clara University. And we're both members of the Northern California Network for Community Academic Partnerships for Environmental Justice, who is co-sponsoring this event.
We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement that's been created collectively by the tribes of the Bay Area. We acknowledge that we're on the ancestral land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people. We recognize that through a violent history of colonization and dispossession, today, as guests, we at Santa Clara University and UC Berkeley benefit from living and working on the traditional homeland of these Native people. We wish to show our respect to them and their ancestors by acknowledging the injustices inherent in this history and by affirming their sovereign rights and their current efforts to achieve restorative justice. We want to acknowledge the ancestors, elders, and relatives, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. We acknowledge that Santa Clara University and UC Berkeley are benefiting from the displacement and dispossession of Native people from their traditional homelands.
Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, it is vitally important that we recognize that the land on which we reside is unceded tribal territory, and also acknowledge and support the Native peoples that continue to form a crucial part of our San Francisco Bay Area community today. We also acknowledge that Native peoples remain dedicated to fulfilling their obligation to Creator, to care for Mother Earth and all living things, and to return sacredness to the land, water, and air through the restoration of traditional knowledge and stewardship led by the original Bay Area tribes. We're so pleased to introduce our panel of distinguished speakers today. This panel has an extensive experience in water justice, tribal water rights, community activism, and engagement, and we're very honored that they've joined us for this important conversation. Gregg Castro is Salinan on his father's side and Ramaytush and Randian Ohlone on his mother's side. He has been involved in preservation of his cultural heritage for nearly 3 decades. Gregg began his early work in ecological preservation within his Salinan homeland. While on the Salinan Nation Tribal Council, he has consulted with the National Forest Service, Friends of the River, and others. He is currently the culture director for the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone Council.
Charlie Toledo. Charlie Toledo is of Toa descent and native to New Mexico. She is the executive director of the Suscol Intertribal Council. She has extensive experience in regional, statewide, national, and international forums. Charlie has served on the Low Income Oversight Board to the California Public Utilities Commission. She received the California Tribal Water Summit Recognition Award and has a lifelong commitment to social and environmental justice.
Kanyon Sayers-Roods is Suscol Ohlone and an Indigenous two-spirit relative. She's a graduate of the Art Institute of California, and her art has been featured at the Young Museum, the SumArts Gallery, and numerous powwows and Indigenous gatherings. Kanyon is the co-founder of and CEO of Kanyon Konsulting, where she strives to bridge the gap between Indigenous and contemporary value systems. She has been the opening speaker at events such as the Global Climate Action Summit.
Alexander Tavizon is a member of the Choctaw and Blackfoot Nations and a graduate of UC Berkeley. He's been the Bay Area Tribal Project Manager for the California Indian Environmental Alliance for the past 4 years. And in this role, he provides technical assistance for tribal leadership and tribal staff to increase capacity in order for tribes to advocate on their own behalf for their own people.
And James Muller is the Principal Environmental Planner at the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. In this capacity, he manages the Integrated Regional Water Management Program funded by the California Department of Water Resources. This program has secured 4 implementation grants, funding 46 projects and 1 involvement grant, working with over 15 Bay Area disadvantaged community and tribal partners. James has a Master's of Science in Environmental Management from the University of San Francisco.
So just a brief word on the structure for today. We'll first be hearing from Alex and James about their community engaged research testing tap water with the Disadvantaged Community and Tribal Involvement Program. Next, we'll hear from Charlie, Gregg, and Kanyon, whose communities have all been a part of this program. And following, we'll have the opportunity to engage in a dialogue with all of the presenters. So I invite you to put your questions in the chat, which we'll be monitoring throughout the presentation. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first speakers.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for having us here today. And thank you so much to our tribal members for being here with us today. My name is James Muller with the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. And I'll work to give you all a framework of the project that we're going to be discussing today and the origins of the tap water quality testing program. And this grant was provided by the Department of Water Resources, specifically to do involvement work with communities and with tribes to assess their needs related to water. It was a statewide initiative that was implemented at the regional level. And SFEP, the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, was an entity coordinating this effort in the Bay Area. And I want to say that it's worth noting that with this regional needs assessment, the state didn't provide frameworks or guidelines for this work, and every region did it differently within California. The Bay Area decided to do things a bit differently and contracted with over 15 community groups, nonprofits, a couple of public entities, and SIA, who led the work with the tribes and tribal organizations to do the needs assessments in their own communities and within their own tribes. This approach allowed the communities and tribes to be funded to collect their own needs and convey them to the state and to other public agencies. And we were the only region that used this model. Our approach ensured that a vast majority of the funding was making its way deeply into communities and into tribes. And it's worth noting that two of the pillars of equity are full participation and self-determination, which this grant pursued. So this is a brief overview of the San Francisco Estuary Partnership to give you all an idea of where we're coming from. We're a EPA place-based program, and our EPA are federal and legislative partners. ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, and MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, are our regional partners in our institutional home. On the bottom right, I have a table of the implementation grants mentioned at the top of this presentation, highlighting here the Disadvantaged Community and Tribal Involvement Program. Within the Integrated Regional Water Management Program, IRWIM, you may hear me say for short, this was the very first grant of its kind. All the other grants were implementation focused, moving dirts, installing pipes, bringing down dams, and this really funded communities and tribes to voice their needs, a very different approach to collecting that information than traditional approaches, which have been government coming in, assessing those needs themselves, and then implementing projects that they think address those needs. So really reverse that dynamic.
So SEIA first started its program in 2006 when we had gotten to do work with the California Mercury Awareness Program for tribal youth and for pregnant mothers. We started this work by really wanting to help deteriorate the form of methodology that you're not supposed to eat fish when you're pregnant. Because, for example, Native mothers, they have cultural foods that they have part of their ceremonies. And so we wanted to be able to bring more awareness to that and help educate the amount of fish you can eat in every certain area based off the mercury levels of what is recommended. And that started out with what we were doing, working, supporting Indian health centers, educating different types of forms of practices of medicine. And then in 2013, 2012, we started going more towards the IRWM, which is the Integrated Regional Water Management Program. We started working with the North Coast in this process, which was working with 34 different tribes, both federally and unfederally recognized tribes. And through this process, we were able to really build that connection and start a foundation for allowing the tribes to really be the lead of what SEIA's work has been. Through the process, we've actually been very supportive in having those 34 different tribes share coordinating committee seats at the governing body and decision-making body for the North Coast region of the IRWM. And we use that tactic to really push into the work that we started to do more for the Mountain Counties regions of the IRWM, for the Sacramento River funding area, as well as for the San Francisco Bay. And we've used all of these different forms of allowing the tribes to be the leader of the bosses and SEIA's work by developing a tribal advisory committee. And we've been very fortunate to have created one here in the Bay Area, which I will talk about soon.
So just a quick snapshot here. As mentioned, this is an IRWIM grant program, and it's very unique from other grant programs. I've worked on other state and federal grants, and this is managed at the regional level by a group called the IRWIM Coordinating Committee. And with this type of grant program, the state appropriates funds to each funding area, each region, San Francisco Bay region being on the screen here on the right. And these grants focus on the 4 bullets that you see here. Those are the focus areas. And so giving you that structure of this grant program, what did we do in this involvement program? So the state asked us in this grant to conduct a regional needs assessment. As I mentioned before, we worked at the hyperlocal level with communities and tribes, and they led the effort in their communities. So we worked with 17 cities, 4 tribes, 2 tribal organizations, and we worked with people experiencing homelessness. This effort was informed by over 2,000 surveys, over 100 meetings, listening sessions, and interviews. And I want to note that Downtown Streets team and Voices surveyed approximately 700 homeless youth and adults that are not included in that 2,000 survey number there on the bullet. And to the right, you'll see a map that have red and orange regions, and these show disadvantaged communities that the state has identified through census tracts. We worked with many of these communities across the Bay Area. And above that, you'll see a strip of icons that represent the top 5 priorities identified by these communities and tribes through this process. And those include, and there are a multitude, but these are the most common. Those include distrust in drinking water, flooding, trash, industrial contamination, and green spaces or environmental concerns. The regional needs assessment hosts all of these community level needs assessments and rolls up the findings at the regional level as well. It will also contain a swath of lessons to be learned, which I think is an important distinction. Lessons learned is not something that I think we can say with true belief. I think we have a lot of lessons to be learned as public agencies, and the communities and the tribes have been sharing these lessons for a long time, and I think public agencies have a lot to do to catch up to that. So lessons to be learned that are informed by the communities and by the tribes in their own words to public entities wishing to engage with them. I do want to note that this report is almost complete. It will be released next month, and we'll have all of this information, and we'll also have the needs assessments from the tribes in a completely independent tribal section in there as well.
So in 2019, when we started doing this work, SEIA actually was asked to review a document that was created by the coordinating committee called the Bay Area Integrated Regional Water Management Plan. And so in reviewing this document, I noticed that they did not mention or state that there were any tribes in the Bay Area. And as you all know, this is a big concern because there are many tribal presence in the Bay Area as well as tribal organizations. So our first step that we did as NCIA was reaching out to these different tribes and tribal organizations that you see here on the list of the Almatson Tribal Band, the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, the Hemarin Ohlone Saklan Tribe, Hakin Bay Miwok Plains Miwok, the Indian People Organizing for Change, also known as the Coyote Land Trust, as well as the Mwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area and Napa Suscol Intertribal Council. These were the organizations and tribes that decided to partner at one point or another with SIA in helping update this water management plan that was created. But there were many other tribes in the Bay Area that either chose at that point in time to focus more internally on capacity, or at that time chose not to work with SIA in developing and updating this regional water management plan. But nonetheless, we still at the beginning had to reach out to all these tribes because there was no specific book. There was no number to call to reach all the tribes. So what SIA did that was very unique in this case was when we had reached out, we had attended many different forms of powwows, gatherings, tribal organizations, and we individually met each one of these, myself, met each one of these different chairmen or tribal members, and we developed this relationship. And through this process, over the course of time, we were able to build our own tribal advisory committee, as I mentioned, the North Coast had developed. And so what that really allowed us to do was to put all of these tribal members and tribal chairs and tribal organizations in the same room and to really go over some of the larger concerns and make documents like we had went over earlier, which was the land acknowledgement that was created by all of these different organizations you see here and tribes coming together for the first time and being able to share openly what they want to have be said for their different individual groups and tribes. And this is a process. I mean, there, unfortunately, due to the cost of living in the Bay Area and a lot of lateral oppression that's been created over time with tribes in the Bay Area, that it's been very hard to all come together. So we're very fortunate in this grant that it had the involvement component, which allowed for the tribes to build the capacity and for us to ask them all to gather in person together here. Because what SIA really wants to do is to be able to ask these different tribes, you know, what can we do to support your work in building technical assistance for each of the tribes, individual approach, workshops, capacity building, whatever it may be. We always look at it as individual approach because each tribe and tribal organization is different. There is no one size fits all for all of these different groups. And to kind of lead into it, with having the tribal advisory committee created, we were able to talk about back in 2019, having tribal members represent their tribes and or tribal communities at a decision-making body level with the coordinating committee. And this was a process that had started in 2020 when we had asked and had a different tribe at least attend have at least one different tribal member or tribe attend each coordinating committee starting in 2020. So we were able to show that not only do we want to have these tribal members and tribes be a part of this decision-making body, but they're showing the effort that they will be a part of it. And so due to that, we were able to actually have the different tribes and tribal communities be a part of this governance structure and hold 3 seats. And those 3 seats have been divided up amongst the different tribes. And there are 3 alternative seats to also give other tribes that are potentially smaller or other tribes that don't have as much capacity to be alternatives, which then it still allows their voice to be heard. So we're very fortunate to have that caucus come together to really explain what the tribes want. And through that process, we also started the needs assessment, which was a very meticulous kind of conversation because it had to go over for all these different tribes and tribal organizations. What are their concerns? Is it fire related? Is it water, tap water issues? Is it water stability? You know, what can we better ask the whole tribe as a whole and all the different tribes to better understand their concerns? And so the tribes, when we all gathered during the tribal advisory committee, were able to develop 100 different questions to ask each individual member. And it was one of the largest needs assessment that was administered during this program. And through the process of it, we were able to identify that there was a concern from the tribes that water was not only a concern, but also fire and capacity building. But the tap water program had a little bit of mistrust. There was a concern about what there was in their tap water and how they can better be aware and be able to, express it, because not everyone has that ability to express it. So we talked about the affordability of water, but really we wanted to give the tribal members who wanted to the ability to express their concern. And so during that, we were actually able to develop a tap water testing program that all of the panelists here were able to be a part of and to share their insight and get the knowledge of what is coming from their water from the water agency.
All right, so as Alex mentioned, tap water quality was a concern among the tribes and among the communities we work with as well. This was a ubiquitous finding. There was no group we worked with that didn't have some level of mistrust of tap water documented in these surveys. Again, over 2,000 surveys, hundreds or over 100 meetings and listening sessions informed these results. And what we found were, we had anecdotal stories of poor taste, odor, discoloration, skin irritation, burning eyes, hair falling out. And as Alex mentioned, communities and tribes are not monoliths, right? So each community is going to have their own relationship with public agencies, public entities. And for a very long time, public agencies have not been good stewards of those relationships. So this mistrust is deep, and it is a result of these historical relationships. And what we also found is that there's an overwhelming use of bottled water to address that mistrust. And as we can all imagine, bottled water is more expensive. It creates more waste. It's also, one could argue, not as well regulated as tap water. And so there was a groundswell of support for a third-party effort to do tap water quality testing regionally. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that tap water quality testing was not a novel approach to this mistrust out of this program. There are other groups, All Positives Possible, and Vallejo is a great example, that have done tap water quality testing in the past, not at this scale. But there are groups that have been fighting for this type of work for long before the needs assessment happened. And I do want to tell that story as well, because this was not a novel idea coming from SFEP or public agencies. This has been requested for quite some time. And so there's a lot of text here, but what I want to orient you to on the right are the communities that identify that mistrust in tap water. So those are the blue circles. The brown letters are the regions that the tribes identified, and all of those entities identify that mistrust in tap water. So you see Marin City and San Rafael there in Marin County. We had Petaluma, the Springs, Dillon Beach, Point Reyes, Vallejo, Richmond, Oakland, East Palo Alto down there at 11, and San Jose down there at 9. So very common finding this mistrust in tap water. And we have goals. So we responded to this and we decided we'll support the communities and support the tribes in collecting information about tap water quality that can address that mistrust at the roots. And the goals here were to increase trust in tap water, to generate regional data that's informative and that's defensible, to increase understanding among the public and communities and among tribes around water quality policy and science, very complicated subject, and to build and strengthen partnerships at that local level between communities and their public agencies and tribes and their public agencies. Because after this grant is done, after James goes away, those communities and those tribes and those public agencies are going to remain. And so something we want to leave in our wake are hardline pipelines of communication that will exist after the grant is done. And at a snapshot here, and this is my final slide, we'll leave this up for a moment. I wanted to just give some facts at a glance here, and it looks like I have so much text it went off the screen here. We're collecting over 700 samples. Our last samples are due at the end of the month. And I do want to note that the community partners and tribal partners are collecting the samples and sending it in to ELAP certified labs. So this is a California certification for labs, and they're using industry standards to assess these samples. We're looking at over 100 different analytes. We're comparing them against California regulatory standards to ensure we're all on the same page in terms of looking at the data we get and using California standards in terms of follow-up if we see MCL exceedances. And I do want to note here that this program was modeled after the needs assessment as well. So this This regional program came out of that needs assessment, and we turned the control over at the local level to the communities and the tribes as well. So we provided a general framework. We contracted with Simple Lab to facilitate the logistics of this program, but it was up to the communities to decide exactly which panels they were going to use. We had several different panels with different sets of analytes, who was going to participate, what regions of the city. We helped them with those processes, but again, this was self-determination at the hyperlocal level. I also want to note that all the participants in this program will have access to their own data, both the organizations and the participants themselves. The utilities that were working in their service areas, we were all briefed on this program, and we also briefed the State Division of Drinking Water about 6 months before we even started taking samples. And of course, Simple Lab is the entity we're working with to coordinate the logistics. So they send the kits out with the bottles. Our outreach partners work with the community partners and the tribes to collect those samples and then mail them into the labs where they get analyzed. The results are posted in an online format. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave this up for just a moment. I know there's a lot of text there, but want to thank, this is the end of our presentation, and thank everyone for your time. And we'll turn it over to the panel.
And I just would like to add one last note. Of the 700 samples we're looking at, over 100 of them are coming from tribes and tribal community members. And now we're going to go ahead and ask different panelists just a small brief introduction of what type of water issues are they seeing within their community. And first, I'd like to introduce Kanyon and ask her to please speak on behalf of what kind of water issues you're seeing in the Indian Canyon, along with the awareness of being able to identify if there's water issues outside of the Bay Area that you're seeing.
Mishmin Tuhis, Conroe Canyon, Coyote Woman, Sayers-Roods. Coming from Indian Canyon Nation, the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara, has afforded me many privileges and opportunities to have a different lived experience than many Indigenous relatives here in the Bay Area. Daughter of tribal chairwoman Anne Marie Sayers, we live off the grid in a valley, and it has always been stewarded by Indigenous peoples. However, it's in the South Bay. And with my experience with the dock tip earworm projects, I've noticed that the 9 counties that have the most lucrative opportunities are the ones that are considered and managed and witnessed. Yet in the South Bay, there isn't any consultation with Indigenous peoples. There isn't any inclusion. There is limited offerings of diversity, let alone equity. And through this experience of navigating contracts with the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone peoples and Himrin, and participating in many of these gatherings and projects, I have realized that it would be wonderful for agencies and organizations to take steps to include Indigenous peoples, because in all honesty, when thinking about Indigenous peoples and truth and history, there's so much insight that you can lean to when it comes to the original stewards of these lands that we benefit and have settled upon. I honestly believe that through honoring truth and history and Indigenous pedagogies, we can strategize sustainable futures. There's a difference of how we approach decision-making, and there's a difference in just how we recognize the environment. It is not a resource to be extracted. It is a relative. How are our decisions and our actions impacting not only ourselves, our community? And when I say community, I am including our plant, animal, and even bug, creepy crawly, every environmental, recognize the rights of nature is pretty much what I mean by recognizing our community. How our actions and words impact our community and the next 7 generations, and that's considering that's short term. I want to point out that accessibility. I'm lucky to have this contract here in the Bay Area to be able to test the water, because I happen to rent and live here in Santa Clara Valley in Kanyon Ohlone territory. And I work with many community members in San Francisco, the East Bay region, so I get to learn about waters there. However, it has been a lot of work to advocate for just transparency. There's a lot of trust. There's a lot of struggle with trust in regards to government agencies and inclusive measures that Indigenous peoples are considered. Many a time, our communities are tokenized. And it has been really eye-opening. I feel really lucky to have participated in these programs. And I just want to point out that it has been with other contracts and other opportunities that I was tokenized because I have a beautiful singing voice. And that has afforded me many opportunities to enter in some of these circles. But it has been through inclusive measures of the community who opened those doors. So I want to remind you that even if you may not be a director or a larger decision maker, that sometimes just opening the door and strategically taking those steps to have inclusive measures to bring in Indigenous peoples or communities and actually allow us to have government to government consultation efforts and endeavors, beautiful results can come from this. And I'm just humbled to be in the presence with these amazing elders and community members. I just happen to be a loudmouth Indigenous relative who's like, all right, we need to be included. Are you considering our perspective? Are you including Indigenous community voices? And sometimes it's counter what we think, like decisions about when they mentioned the first of its occurrence, where usually an agency is like, these are the struggles that we're having and this is how we're going to solve it. That doesn't really actually ask, hi, local Indigenous community, what are some of the struggles that you're having? And instead of immediately saying, oh, I know how to solve it, actually listening. Because much of the time, and this is in other circles as well, just a superficial idea of like, what's the struggles? And at the beginning of this project, to be quite honest, many of us were like, not quite sure how to answer some of these questions and how to navigate it. Because in Ohlone territory, a contemporary term that the Bay Area is known as, many of us are priced out. So many of our relatives are not even local, even though that these are our homelands. And we, as the lineal descendants, are the original stewards, and we need to take care of our homelands. The biggest issue is awareness, our communal awareness, honoring truth and history about the history that has transpired here, how everyone here today has come to be here. Because if you are not on the land of your ancestors and the land of their ancestors and their ancestors, then you are a visitor. How are you being a good guest? How are we making decisions that are beneficial to our environment? And so how are we in community together? And if you don't know the history of these spaces and places that we occupy, how can we be making good decisions going forward? And so I talk about awareness. I talk about accessibility to resources and education, awareness of Indigenous peoples and histories, and how all of our communities came to be here. Because I'm happy to be in community with everyone. We just need to know truth so we can honor the past to shape the future.
Thank you, Kanyon. I also just want to add to that is one of the questions we actually were able to ask in the needs assessment was how many of the tribal members who were able to fill it out live on their ancestral territorial lands. And unfortunately, only 30% of the tribal members that we were able to ask live on their ancestral territorial lands because of cost of living, because of jobs. And it isn't very unfortunate. And with that, I'd like to just give a small introduction to Charlie and ask her what type of tribal community issues have you noticed within the being a part of the low income oversight board as an advisor to the California Public Utilities Commission.
Well, I would just ditto what everything that Kanyon said. I thought, oh no, I won't have anything left to say. So I won't repeat it, but I think the biggest issue up in Napa County is the scarcity, that we're running out of water. And my position on the low income oversight board, which was about 8 years, I was able to advocate at the state level to begin to change policies. And the biggest thing, and that's why it was so wonderful when Alex approached us at, I guess we were to Powell and Vallejo. And he said he waited in line to talk to me, but I didn't know there was a line. The Native people need to be heard, that we're invisibilized, erased. That the history, the people, not just the people themselves, but the memory and the names of the tribes of the people. That was all wiped out. And that's been since I've been advocating for over 30 years on behalf of Indigenous people of California, but also, globally. Indigenous peoples of the world, working in international policy through the UN. But then when I was appointed to the Low Income Oversight Board, which was an advisory board of the California Public Utilities Commission, which, regulates all these agencies. I was in a position to start lobbying for policy change. And it took a long time. I was the one voice there. When I first went and I first started to serve on that board, the Public Utilities Commission didn't even know there were tribes in California. And that is the norm. It's just barely changing. That's what we were talking about. It's like this last 6 months or something. It seems like they were like, whoa, they realized, oh, there are Indian people here and they're still living and they have, we've been the land stewards for, thousands and thousands of years. And what people don't realize, when you take the land stewards off the land, we get what's happening right now. We're in a severe water crisis. I lobbied for 20 years at state levels with different agencies, another community technology foundation. We were trying to help unserved groups or underserved groups have access to power centers. And finally that's shifting. And through IRWIM and the work that SIA did, bringing the tribes together, helping people realize there are tribes, the land stewards are still here. The wisdom is still here. You remove the people who are caretaking the land for more than 10,000 years, you get the state of emergency that exists right now in all of California. And what the people in Los Angeles don't realize, and why I got marginalized eventually on that low-income oversight board, because I didn't talk about it. Every meeting, we met quarterly around the state. We had the ear of the Governor Brown. And a lot of policies did change, that one of the biggest things was that every state agency has to have a memorandum of consultation with the tribes in their region. And that was really important language that we really pushed for, because there's so many regions that don't have their tribes of origin there anymore. They were wiped out. There were genocides in California, mass forest relocations, bloody runs. So that region means that, like Napa, which always said, there's no Indians here, they moved north. And it was some kind of poetic move north. No, it was a forced genocide that wiped out the largest, longest continuously inhabited place in North America is Napa County. There is no land-based tribe there anymore. So I think just that invisibility, and then now we are in a state of emergency and have been for 10 years. I've been advocating for 10 years. And I've been saying at state and international levels at the UN, the time to conserve water is when there's still water to conserve. And we're kind of at the tipping point. We don't have water. In Napa County, wells are dry, water's dry. The watershed coming down from Lake County, the water levels aren't high enough to flow through Hootie Creek to come. And so like St. Helena, Pope Valley, where we have a land base in Charles Pope Valley, we have 20 acres and we do have spring-fed water for the first time in 20 years. It started to go dry last summer. Fortunately, water's close to the surface, so we still have it. But it's not high enough to come down from Clear Lake and come through the lakes anymore. And this is where the water that Los Angeles, all of Central Valley, their water comes from. And at the state levels, especially in Southern California, and dealing with all those agencies, they still don't know that we're out of water. It's not hypothetical. It's real. So that's the biggest problem, is the scarcity and the lack of informed population. So thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Charlie. And lastly, I'd like to take the time to ask Gregg, what historical coastal water rights have you seen with it, and also within Indigenous rights within your tribal community?
Shatuhi, Mishistu, Shamasukish, greetings to you all. Thank you for having me here, and want to acknowledge the Tamian ancestors on whose land we're in, probably their bones we're sitting on right now. And that's the reality that we deal with every day as Native people, indigenous to this place, and trying to take care of our homelands, because within it resides the bones and spirits and reality of our ancestors. And that's really the fundamental thing here, beyond and before the science. And there's so much science that we may not have time to talk about, but for us, fundamentally, what comes first is the moral, ethical, spiritual values attached to the lands that our Creator put us on, that we feel obligated and committed to taking care of. And historically, we've been prevented from doing that. And how that's translated now into modern times is a plethora of laws and regulations and processes and procedures that prevent us, and sometimes out now dismiss us because they, as the other speakers said, don't think we're here anymore. And so we have to reestablish our commitment and our sacred obligations to our homeland through this legal and social process and administrative process. And so we use the tools that are given to us. And part of that is the struggle to understand the layout of what we're dealing with. And so legally, things like water rights is just to us insane. So I'll just say it that way. Very technical term, insanity. Some issues we've dealt with just the last couple of years over in the San Mateo county coast, of the overlay of different regulations and processes and authorities over small amounts of water, and then having to encounter somebody called a water master, who actually isn't the master of anything, but that's the title they have. And you have to go ask that person to do something or to have something in terms of water and other things. And then they say, well, that's fine, but I have to go ask 20 other people. So obviously they're not master of anything, but they regulate and they authorize, and you have to go through them, and they have to go through other people. And that is the layering of the colonial process that's been happening since the first Europeans showed up 250 years ago. And it's getting deeper and higher in all different kinds of ways every year. And while we're struggling to deal with these issues of water quality, some of these other issues are being kind of ignored, really, because they are too tangled up in the legal system. And so you push back as much as you can to deal with those issues. And sometimes you find loopholes to exploit, which is sort of the American way, right? That's what we do. And so Native people, well, if they can do that, we can do that too. And we have and will, because the needs of our people and our land are relative, as Kanyon said. The land itself is a relative. We view it as a living thing. And that is something that's not encompassed by the legal and administrative process. It's the spiritual values, the spiritual relationship we have for the land that gave us birth. So that goes far beyond a commitment of authority or of employment or even living, but of existing. We didn't exist prior to this land, and we exist because of this land. And we exist because of the water that the land gifted us with. And now that water is entangled in this morass of laws and regulations and the consequences of colonial empire that have polluted it to a high extent. So even in supposedly clear water, it's not all that clear. And as was mentioned earlier, a lot of us don't live in the place that gave us birth. We've had to move around. I'm Rumson Ohlone as well on my mother's side, and that's the Monterey County. And Ramaytush are north of us here in the San Francisco Peninsula, and yet I live here in San Jose area because of historical reasons of movement of people and looking for jobs and trying to survive. So most of the landscape that you see here and the work that we do is directly related to the survival tactics we've had to employ, which includes being reformed as communities that have no resemblance to really to prehistoric times, as they say, to traditional times. But they're the result of trying to survive and continue. And so that's really complicated, isn't it? Yes, it is for us too.
Oh,
It is for us too. So, and then we get into the scientific aspects, which we probably don't have time to go into very much. But one thing I wanted to mention is that as Native people, we see everything is one unified whole. And colonial European science embodied in this university who I actually was a student of. I was an engineering student many decades here ago. So I know, and I've been a tech worker, and I work with colonial European science every single day. And I know the process. And it's to break things down to its smallest component and manipulate and utilize the component without really seeing how it's connected to everything else. And that's the consequence of what we're dealing with now with the environment and with water, is not seeing how doing something over here in this little part that we artificially isolated is now affecting something else somewhere else. And we've erased that connection and that relationship in this quest to understand it, to go to the atomic level, and then now talking about quarks as though they're living in isolation. But those quarks build up to something else until you get to the cosmic level, and it's all connected. And that sounds kind of very esoteric. But when you talk about the reality of water and the landscape, and when you talk about water is the connector for different landscapes. So whatever you do for water over here, it's going to show up over here. And so that aspect of native philosophy, of spiritual value, of things being connected, is counter to how the legal administrative process occurs in the environment, especially with water rights and water authority and water allocations and water responsibility, because there's certainly lots of instances where water was not taken care of properly, was polluted, and the person who caused that gets to walk away. So now we're all left holding the bag through our governments, who often struggle to deal with it, either financially or even the scientific understanding, or even admitting that it's there. So we're still in this process of entangling that morass of weeds that we've created around the environment, and water is the central part of it. For us, water is a meme now of water is life. Water is alive. And that doesn't just give us life, it's alive itself. It is itself considered a relative in spiritual indigenous terms. And we're not treating our relative the right way. And so we have to get back to that idea of it being a living thing that gives us life. And maybe then we'll start changing our attitude and our legal and social system to treat it the way it needs to be treated so that we can continue to survive.
Thank you very much. Before we jump into questions from the chat, I just want to let everyone know, and for in the room, that unfortunately we may not be able to get to all of the questions at this point in time, but we will try to get, answer some later and after the event has happened. But for the first question, I just wanted to give a little context. This question is beforehand. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to really dive into talking about all of the tap water results. So we haven't been able to really fully go through all of the research that is going to be needed. And just to give context to that, I just wanted to be more aware. But the first question is for myself and James, is on tap water, there should be microbial pathogens also analyzed.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. We actually did. We had a number of E. coli and fecal coliform tests that were conducted, and I just want to note that we spent about a year putting the framework together for this program before turning it over to the tribes and for the communities to implement it in their areas in the ways that they saw fit. And a lot of that was research, and something that I feel we really missed the ball on here was coliforms are everywhere, and coliform testing, especially water sampling with microbials, is subject to a high degree of error, right? So you can have coliforms that are in the aeration unit of a faucet that live there. If you put the cap down on the counter, you can get cross-contamination there. If you touch the cap in the wrong place with your hand, you can get contamination there. So unfortunately, the coliform and E. coli tests that we did aren't as informative or defensible as we had hoped. And so we did do a little bit of that, found out too late, unfortunately, that those specific tests weren't as defensible as we had hoped. But we did include them. They were one of our panels with the other ones that we mentioned as well. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. And I want to also add that, as I mentioned, we haven't been able to go over the results of all the tap water test kits. We don't necessarily have any, if many that have asked and said that they want to be a part of this regarding Native and tribal members who have science backgrounds. So for those on the chat who are able to or would like to volunteer some of help, we would really appreciate having that tribal presence. So please put any information you have in the chat. Would be really greatly appreciated. This next question I'm going to ask is going to go more to the panelists, and then after this one, I wanted to hear if there's any questions in the room for any of the panelists or myself or James. But this next one is going to be so popcorn style. Whoever wants to take a hit at it. What can researchers provide? Are there research needs that academics can address to support your particular community?
I think the researchers need to apply themselves to the experts, the Indigenous experts. And I think that science so far, especially in relationship to climate justice and climate rights, has been focused on the problems, not the solutions. And there's a huge amount, like Greg alluded to, that within the Indigenous wisdom is way more advanced than Western science. That's my point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, we were aware of climate change, even though we weren't even calling it climate change. 75 years ago, our elders were telling us we're in big trouble. They could tell already just by walking outside their door, if they happen to live in their homeland or wherever they're living actually, and see the changes at, you know, when you as Native people, when you've been in a place for 10,000 years, you kind of know the place, right? If you've been in your home, you know, since you were a kid, you know, you could probably walk around in the middle of the night with your eyes closed and not bump into anything unless somebody didn't clean up. And that's sort of what we're dealing with now. You know, we can walk around our homelands and see things, except the parts that aren't cleaned up, and go, wait a minute, that doesn't belong there. That's not right. And we've been hearing this for decades before they came up with the term climate change, or whatever their term will become popular next week. But the change we've been seeing for a long time, because we're such intimately connected in a relationship with the homelands that gave birth to us. And that's our science. And as we're seeing with fire ecology, we're finally getting that edge where people, you know, the supposedly experts are saying, gee, they really know a bunch of stuff, don't they? And they're actually applying some of our science to the fire ecology. Maybe it's in panic mode, and maybe that's where we have to go as a society in order to look to Indigenous science to get into panic mode. Well, we're getting there with water, aren't we? And so maybe they'll come to our scientists and say, gee, this kind of stumps us. Our science isn't giving us an answer, it just gives us lots of questions. And that's where the collaboration, the building of relationships, which is required so that trust is part of it, because we're imparting deep emotional, spiritual values when we share our science. And we know what's happened with that knowledge that's gone out of our communities in the past. So why would we think it's changed now? Well, it comes from building a trusting relationship with these agencies and with these people who come to us and treat us with respect, and treat our elders and our scientists with respect, that they have comparable, perhaps different knowledge to share.
Thank you. Now, for those in the room, are there any questions you'd like to ask today? Let's take the front here, please.
Yeah, so your example of the fire issue and the sort of panic last minute made me think to what extent do you see kind of parallel things happening in the realm of water? Are there examples where you starting to see that, or is it still like not so much?
I don't think it's quite at the same level of panic, but it needs to be. But maybe Charlie, I think up north, maybe you're seeing.
Right, we've had fire storms, so it's way too late to be panicked. And the reason I was so neutralized on that low income oversight board, or gradually got, neutralized because I was so outspoken, was because the governor was more concerned about his legacy than informing the public about the water crises. And it's actually a global crisis. I know the first time I went to UN in 2005, I thought, I'm going to bring to the attention of the UN the water crisis that's happening in California. And I found out it was a global crisis. And India, parts of South America, China, they're already beyond. They're migrating and bringing water from other parts of the world, because it's so severe. And the reason the governor didn't want, and I thought Governor Newsom would take the ball because he clearly understands how serious it is. Their fear is they do not want to create panic in the public to know how severe the crisis is around water. And I think the biggest thing is there's only one water, and that can seem simple, one water. But there's only one water on the earth, and it's all connected, and the earth is not producing more water. Like our oxygen is, the trees, the ocean replenishing the earth, this cosmic dust is feeding the earth. So the dirt of the earth is constantly being fed, but the water is only one water. So it's not just California that's in a crisis, it's a global crisis. I was at the UN in 2005 when they said 5 years, we will be in a severe water crisis. And at that international leadership level, there were no solutions. It was a 5-minute discussion. When the scientists of the world, the leaders of the world were asked, what solutions do you have? They had none. It's bad.
It's because business as usual is more important. When it comes to fire and fire suppression, my private property is more important. Instead of having cultural burns, how do we protect these private properties? How do we protect our assets, our entitlements? Humans constantly are entitled because we are raised in a capitalistic, materialistic, disposable society model of which we have disconnected and desecrated our true obligation and responsibility to being good stewards of the earth. It means saying no to investments. It means saying no to quarter and dividends. It means saying no to the conveniences that we've so grown accustomed to. But no, we don't want to because it's business as usual. We don't do things that way. That's not how it's supposed to be. Because we have constantly eliminated our responsibility. Because, garbage, waste management, disposal, like out of sight, out of mind. This building. Has any of you ever been in school up until your adulthood right now, ever thought, did you know that you are privileged to be in this building, that the ground beneath this building will never feel the sunlight, will never feel the rain? Does that even matter to you? Do you consider the roads that you benefit off of invade and desecrate the forest? Do you care? It's because of our belief systems as humans of the 21st century that we don't even prioritize these things. That's why this issue is so big, and that's why limited time and effort and energy is being considered to it. We're all freaking out, but we're all operating in our silos. So when it comes to fire suppression, when it comes to fire, not being scared of fire. Fire is sacred. We need fire. Only you could prevent forest fires actually negates and makes us feel like we're scared of. Same thing with water. These large corporations are allowed to pollute water and walk away. Private industries are allowed to do these things, and we just say, it's just the way it is, or we can't beat them in court, or we can't, okay, then you might not be able to witness your grandchildren appreciate the forest. You may not be able to witness your community have the privileges that you've grown up with. Things have changed, and it's in less than 200 years, the devastation of the ecology of just the Americas is catastrophic. Actually, just 100 years. And people try and talk about indigenous peoples as archaic and as savage and primitive. You know what? The decision-making today is primitive. Indigenous peoples have been stewarding these lands since time immemorial. Wonderfully. I might be romanticizing certain elements, but humans are humans. When you are brought up in an environment where you are given that understanding of that sacred obligation, you're going to make decisions that prioritize your community. And when you recognize how we are in community with the environment, and those are our relatives, you're going to be making decisions that consider everyone, not just people, not just profit, not just your legacy, your human legacy. Try to point that out.
I just thought of something that shows the lack of panic, right? And I think Alex mentioned earlier, and that was bottled water, plasticated water, right? If you go into Food for Less or Costco, you see stacks and stacks of containers of water. Now, who's here not complaining about gasoline price? And yet you're paying more for that water than you're paying for gas even now. That's the insanity. That's the economic skew of this whole thing. If it was really a panic, we would stop that silliness, you know, or regulate it to the point where the priority to that water would be given to the people that need it in the appropriate place. So whether you agree with the farmers in Central Valley or not in their aspect, the fact is that a lot of that water is getting shipped and put into plastic bottles that come here at more than the price of gas that we're all complaining about. That's the lack of panic.
So I hate to put a pause on this excellent conversation. But I do want to thank all of our presenters for sharing their time and their expertise, and to acknowledge the decades of work that they've contributed to the field of restorative justice. If you'd like to stay in touch and learn about follow-up conversations, we would encourage you to join the Northern California Network for Community Academic Partnerships for Environmental Justice by emailing Iris. And I just want to close by saying that, as we talked about today, California faces growing water insecurity related to water quality and water access. We want to acknowledge that historically, tribal communities have successfully and sustainably managed California's water resources. Now, after 100 years of non-sustainable water use, California is moving back towards a regional water management approach. And while this is a step in the right direction, let's acknowledge that a model for this already exists, and it's embedded in the sustainable practices and in tribal knowledge. So thank you everyone who's here in person and online, and we'll make a recording available as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for coming out.
Thank you for coming out. Really appreciate it. We'll be hanging out for a second. So